today to celebrate knowledge activism in terms of our history, OHCOW's history, the labor movement's history and occupational health and safety history, but also then USW and the role they've played. And then we'll have some research to share about knowledge activism and how its effectiveness in workplaces. And then the arc of that also in celebration of John's 35th anniversary at OHCOW, which happy anniversary, John, as well as OHCOW's 35th anniversary, which happened in February. We want to talk about then how we got into the workplace mental health field, and then our work with the COPSUC and the mental injury toolkit, and then where we're going into the future. So it's a May Day celebration, and we really appreciate everybody joining us today. I think that we are set. Are we set, Tony, in terms of the
Yes.
YouTube? Okay, we're broadcasting live on YouTube. And also, we will put an edited version of the recording up in a few days. And so I think we will start by introducing our first speaker. We had about 100 people signing up, but we usually only get about half come the day of, and then the rest watch later. So Sylvia Boyce is our first speaker. She's director from the National Office of the United Steelworkers and also on OHCOW's board of directors, and a long-standing supporter of OHCOW provincially as well as locally from the Hamilton Clinic, which is where I'm based, as well as John. So Sylvia, I can't access your bio right now since I confused my screen trying to see about projecting the slides. So please, I'm welcoming you, and please introduce yourself further. Thanks.
Good morning, everybody. I'm excited to be here with you all. I thank Val and OHCOW for the invitation. I want to congratulate John Oudyk on his 35 years. John is an amazing individual. He's an expert in health and safety, and he's been a huge support to USW members across Canada and the US. And I want to congratulate OHCOW on their anniversary as well. As Val said, I am the head of the Health, Safety and Environment Department for the United Steelworkers Canadian National Office. And I do sit on the OHCOW Board of Directors and the Workers' Health and Safety Center and many other boards. And I also, prior to working for the United Steelworkers, I was a registered nurse for 17 years. So I'm going to talk to you today. My presentation is about making a difference in knowledge activism on a community scale. And I would like to acknowledge my colleague, Andy Lattiser, who is the District 6 Health and Safety Coordinator for Ontario and Atlantic Canada. Andy is unable to join us today, but he's been very much a significant part of the work that we do in health and safety. And he actually has put together this presentation that you'll see today. So I'll go ahead and begin the presentation. So if anyone has attended the Elliott Lake 50th anniversary event in April, then you will see there'll be a little bit of familiar content here today. We were asked to share that information at this event, and we have added a few additional examples of knowledge activism. Thanks. My PowerPoint. So this here is a slide of the Miners Memorial in Elliott Lake. Anyone who has visited Elliott Lake or read about Elliott Lake in the news would know about this Miners Memorial, but not everyone knows the history behind it. Workers at Elliott Lake knew that their job was compromising their health and safety, and they saw their coworkers dying from silicosis and lung cancer. Miners were required to have a yearly chest x-ray to see if there were signs of silicosis. And despite this yearly check with workers being cleared by the compensation board to work based on the x-rays, many workers were still getting very sick and dying from silicosis and lung cancer. That should have been detected in those x-rays. To add insult to injury, the Compensation Board denied many of the occupational disease, or known at that time industrial disease, claims for silicosis and lung cancer. It was known to the workers and to the USW that the uranium exposures weren't safe, and that the exposure was the cause of so many cancers and illnesses among the workers. They knew it, but they couldn't prove it. So they asked the government if there were any studies about the effects of uranium exposures on miners, and were told that no such studies existed. Then members of the USW from Elliott Lake attended an international symposium on uranium protection in Bordeaux, France, only to hear from a representative of the Ontario Ministry of Health, who gave a presentation on the second day about the effects of uranium exposures on miners in Ontario. It was the government's deceit, the unjust denials from the Workers' Compensation Board, and the terrible, oops, my slides. Oh, there we go. Sorry. It was the government's deceit, the unjust denials from the Workers' Compensation Board, and the terrible working conditions that prompted the Wildcat strike in Ontario, in Elliott Lake, on April 18th, 1974. And that's when they closed off access, off the access road to the mine from the Highway 108, and they launched a Wildcat strike. And among their demands was a list of 54 health and safety issues they wanted addressed. Some miners tried to plead for help from the Minister of Labor and the mining head office in Toronto a few days later. When the Prime Minister was in Sudbury on April 27th, some miners gathered outside the hotel that he was staying at, hoping to get his attention, to no avail. An Elliott Lake miner, Origine Tellier, was suffering from silicosis as well as arthritis at the age of 53, to such an extent that he required a wheelchair. When he started working in the mines, he weighed 150 pounds, but due to illness, he was only 80 pounds when this picture was taken in 1975. And this is just one example of a miner in Elliott Lake suffering from workplace exposures. They were fighting to prevent others from contracting deadly diseases such as silicosis and lung cancer due to the horrible working conditions. In the first 3 months of 1974, there were 107 workers who received pensions for silicosis. Most of the denied claims in Elliott Lake were for lung cancer and other conditions. Because it was before, it was widely accepted that silica as well as radon cause lung cancer. The Ham Commission. And in this picture, you'll see Dr. James Ham, Gib Gilchrist, and Ken Valentine. Their efforts were impossible to ignore, and that the government was forced to take action to protect workers. It was the Wildcat strike that led to the Ham Commission and the resulting legislation that is our Occupational Health and Safety Act. In 1978, the Ontario government passed legislation known as the Occupational Health and Safety Act in response to the concerns of the miners in Elliott Lake. But the federal government stepped in and stated that uranium mining was federally regulated, which meant that the new legislation didn't apply to the miners in Elliott Lake. Their fight wasn't over, and the Canada Labour Code was amended to provide equal protections found in the Occupational Health and Safety Act. Those protections were later incorporated into provincial legislation in other provinces and territories. So, the fundamental rights, the right to know about the hazards in the workplace, the right to participate in protecting in your health and safety, and the right to refuse unsafe work are a part of every jurisdiction's health and safety legislation. Elliott Lake miners are who we need to recognize for fighting to get workers those fundamental health and safety rights. Like every fight for workers' rights, those miners paid for it in blood, sweat, tears, and the loss of life. Now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the origins of OHCOW. It's never been an easy road for injured workers to receive compensation, and claim denials were, and still are, the norm. Family doctors are unfamiliar with evaluating occupational diseases. The first union-sponsored occupational health clinic in North America was started by the United Steelworkers Local 1005 in Hamilton in 1981 in conjunction with doctors from McMaster's Occupational Health Program. And then building on its success, the Ontario Federation of Labour secured an agreement with the Ministry of Labour in 1988 to fund a pilot project, leading to the creation of OHCOW's first clinics in Hamilton and Toronto in 1989, which in turn has now led to OHCOW having offices in several locations to serve all workers in Ontario. We have 7 clinics in Ontario. And OHCOW has been just an invaluable resource to all workers, to the communities, to labor, to employers. And OHCOW has worked with USW at various occupational disease clinics with locals from Sault Ste. Marie, for Algoma Steel. In Sudbury, we had Valet and Nylon Castings. And then in Kitchener, the Rubber Workers Project. The picture shows an overview of what happened on May 9th, 1992. Westray was an underground coal mine in Plymouth, Nova Scotia, and it was only opened for less than 8 months. At 5:20 a.m. on a Sunday morning of May 9th, 1992, an explosion rocked the mine, killing 26 people. There was proof of negligence, but no legal recourse was available to hold the corporation and those in leadership and directing work accountable. The Westray Public Inquiry under Justice Peter K. Richard made several recommendations, and among them was a requirement to amend the Criminal Code of Canada. Justice Richard noted that the Westray story was a complex mosaic of actions, omissions, of incompetence, of mismanagement, of bureaucratic bungling, of deceit, of ruthlessness, of cover-up, of apathy, of expediency, and of cynical indifference. It is a tragic story with the inevitable moments of pathos and heroism, and an event that in all good common sense ought not to have occurred. It did occur, and that is our unfortunate legacy. This past March, it was 20 years since the Westray Law was enacted, and this coming May 9th will be 33 years since the Westray explosion. So this monument that you see on the screen was put up on May 7th, 1993 in Pictou County in Stellarton, Nova Scotia, and it's in a park, and the park is really above the mine site, and the park itself is called Their Light Shall Always Shine. So this is more than a monument, though. It's a tombstone for 11 of the miners who lost their lives that day. John Thomas Bates, Benny Joseph Benoit, Wayne Michael Conway, Roy Edward Feltmate, John Philip Halloran, Randolph Brian House, Stephen Paul Lilly, Michael Frederick McKay, Angus Joseph McNeil, Glenn David Martin, Danny James Popular. You can see on the monument, it's a miner's lamp, and it depicts rays of light emanating out of each side. There's 13 rays of light on each side, and it highlights the names and the ages of the miners. Many of them were quite young. And the symbol is, of the miner's lamp with Their Light Shall Always Shine. And the park itself and the monument is quite beautiful. But as I said, it is a tombstone. And the reality was the mine became too dangerous. Workers voiced their concerns. And unfortunately, the explosion took place and their bodies were never recovered. So when we say no more Westrays, We don't just mean no more mass casualty workplace events. We mean no more workplace deaths without employer accountability. And not every workplace fatality or serious injury will involve criminal negligence, but every worker deserves to have those incidents investigated properly through that criminal lens for the police to make that determination. There have been way too many workers' deaths in the 20 years since the Westray amendments to the criminal code, where employers haven't been held accountable. And that's because of the lack of investigation, lack of evidence, or the Crown decided not to prosecute. So the USW has been calling on the government to make changes that will ensure enforcement of the Westray law. The McIntyre Powder Project. Janice Martel is certainly well known to everybody here, I would believe, for sure, and the incredible work she's done. So in regards to the McIntyre Powder Project, it was a standard practice in mines across Ontario and in other countries for miners to be forced to breathe in aluminum powder, also known as McIntyre powder, before starting their shift under the guise that it would protect their lungs and prevent them from developing silicosis. We now know that the inhalation of aluminum powder simply masked the signs of silicosis to make it hard to detect on X-ray, and that exposure to that powder also caused other illnesses. The Workers' Compensation Board, and also known as the WSIB, had a policy that stated aluminum exposures weren't related to neurological conditions in effect for decades. Miners were denied compensation for illnesses that we now can prove were related to their workplace exposure to McIntyre powder. It was one miner's daughter who lived in Elliott Lake that decided to take on the compensation system because she knew in her heart that her father's illness was from his work as a miner, being exposed to McIntyre powder. The USW is very proud to be among the allies of Janice Martel in this fight and the historic victory, not only in eliminating the policy denying work-relatedness of neurological conditions from aluminum powder exposure, but to now having a presumption of work-relatedness for Parkinson's as a result of exposure to McIntyre powder, and an apology was issued by the provincial government. We are also proud to have Janice as a member of the United Steelworkers family as she continues her fight for justice for workers exposed to McIntyre powder and other occupational diseases. The Diesel Particulate Project. USW Local 6500 in Sudbury partnered with the Center for Research in Occupational Safety and Health, known acronyms are CROSH, at Laurentian University, and the Occupational Health Clinics for Ontario Workers, OHCOW, to work to change the Ontario's legislation for diesel particulate exposure in mining. They succeeded in getting the regulation changed to provide a drastic reduction in diesel emissions. As of September 1st, 2023, the new exposure limit was reduced to a time-weighted average exposure to elemental carbon of not more than 0.12 milligrams per cubic meter of air instead of 0.4 milligrams per cubic meter of air based on total carbon. These are some additional hazards specified in the Occupational Health and Safety Act that we want to also mention that we think is very significant here. Bill 168 received the royal assent on December 15th in 2009, and Bill 132 received royal assent on March 8th, 2016. Bill 168 specified that violence, including domestic violence and harassment, are hazards in the workplace, with Bill 132 later clarifying and including that sexual harassment is a part of workplace harassment. In 1996, Teresa Vince was shot by her boss at Sears in Chatham, Ontario on June 2nd. He had been sexually harassing her for more than a year, and despite filing a complaint against him, the employer took no actions to protect her. Lori DuPont, a nurse at Hotel du Grace Hospital in Windsor, Ontario, was stabbed on November 12th in 2005 by her ex-boyfriend, who also worked at the same hospital. The families of Teresa Vince and Lori DuPont fought for these legislative changes. Employer and supervisor duties to take every precaution reasonable in the circumstances to protect the worker had been a part of the Occupational Health and Safety Act long before the deaths of Teresa Vince and Lori DuPont, or any other victims of workplace violence and harassment. Yet that wasn't enough to protect those workers. It took the very public loss of lives and pressure from the families for the government to specify that protecting workers from violence and harassment was part of the general duties of the employer. Governments need to stop waiting for a body count to make legislative changes, and employers need to take every precaution reasonable to protect workers without having the circumstances stipulated in the legislation. So there's definitely still room for improvement regarding the changes to the Occupational Health and Safety Act for violence and harassment. Currently, there's too much employer control over the issue when it's workers who are at risk. Almost every section regarding violence and harassment in the Act has a reference to a non-existent regulation expressed as prescribed elements, prescribed information, prescribed duties, etc. Employers are required to assess the risk of violence, but there's no such requirement for harassment in the legislation. The right to refuse unsafe work includes violence as a danger to the worker, but it doesn't allow a worker to refuse on the basis of workplace harassment. So we need to have worker involvement in all hazard assessments, and we need a regulation that provides more detail regarding the issue of workplace harassment and violence, and to expand the grounds for refusing unsafe work. So legislation isn't enough. The USW has partnered with the White Ribbon Campaign Foundation organization, the Canadian Football Players Association, and there's this program that we have called Elevating Action Against Gender-Based Violence. So it's really important to address instances of harassment to avoid the behavior escalating to violence. And we need to foster a workplace culture that doesn't tolerate harassment or violence, which is one of the best prevention measures an employer can provide. So when I mentioned that USW has partnered with the Canadian Football Players Association and the White Ribbon organization to provide this training called Elevating Action Against Gender-Based Violence, it's in an effort to change our culture and to challenge gender-based violence in our workplaces and communities. And the legislative change isn't enough. And this program focuses on prevention of gender-based violence to help create a safe work environment for all by encouraging more men to speak up on the issue and to be allies. And this is an effort to protect physical health as well as mental health. And it should be happening in all workplaces for that reason. So these are some ideas for improvement. The first aid regulation to be expanded to include mental health first aid. The first aid regulation, as you know, requires an employer to have first aid supplies and someone who is certified in first aid to provide assistance to workers with physical injuries. It's long past time for a similar provision regarding mental health, and there should be workers trained in mental health first aid to assist those experiencing a mental health issue. Some employers have already started to do this without a legislative requirement, and that shows that the workplace has evolved and needs to adapt for all. The fact that some workplaces have this in place and there haven't been any reports of a negative impact on the business, including productivity, that shows that a supportive workplace is a successful workplace. Employers are required by legislation to provide workers with basic health and safety awareness training. So there should be a requirement to have mental health awareness training, because mental health is a part of your overall health as well as physical activity. A workplace hazard doesn't need to be a tripping hazard or a toxic chemical. It can be a toxic environment that impacts one's mental health. There needs to be the same requirement to address psychosocial hazards in the workplace as there is for physical hazards. We need to foster a workplace culture and society that acknowledges the importance of good mental health while eliminating stigma so that it's okay not to be okay any day. Quebec has mental health included in their right to refuse legislation, and there's no reason for other jurisdictions to have less protection for workers. Workplace inspections need to include psychosocial hazards, and when identified, they need to be addressed. And joint health and safety committees need to be involved in assessing the risks and developing programs, as well as policies for violence and harassment. I have a link up here with a few videos in regards to Elliott Lake's legacy, the miners' fight for safety with the USW Union, and remembering Elliott Lake, as well as a couple of articles learning from the past and reflecting on the radon tragedy in Elliott Lake. And then there's another one, Enough Hot Air, We Want Fresh Air. And it talks about how the Wildcat miners' strike helped to change Ontario law. So these are some things that we can take pride in the accomplishments of the work that the USW and the labor movement and other organizations that you see here on the screen have been working so hard together to try and improve the health and safety for all workers in all workplaces throughout Ontario and the rest of Canada. Thank you. That concludes my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions at the end of the webinar, or however Val wants this to flow. Thank you.
Great. Thanks a lot, Sylvia. That was very comprehensive and very interesting introduction to the discussion today about the sort of the arc of, and it also predates the Elliott Lake strike, but I think it was very pivotal in Ontario's occupational health and safety culture more broadly, which then of course influenced, thankfully, influenced the culture in workplaces by the creation of the Occupational Health and Safety Act and all the other elements that you talked about. I did make a note that we could entertain a few questions right now, but we do also want to hear from our other speakers. So I don't see anyone in the chat. Is anyone, and I don't see anyone with a hand up. So maybe we'll move to Alan to talk about his research around knowledge activism, and we can see how this all fits together, and then we'll move to John, and then we'll have a discussion at the end. So Alan, I'm going to share your slides, I think, and I will set that up, but I just wanted to introduce you with your bio that you're currently an honorary research professor with the sociology department at Memorial University, having retired from your full-time position in 2019, and still involved in research, though, thankfully for us, that you can come and share your knowledge. And some recent publications include a co-edited book called Multidisciplinary Perspectives on Post-Traumatic Stress, a sole-authored book, The Subjectivities and Politics of Occupational Risk, and another co-authored book, Closing the Enforcement Gap, Improving Employment Standards Protections, plus some recent journal articles on capital and class and social and legal studies, which specifically address worker representation in occupational health and safety, which is some of what we're talking about today. So I'm going to share your slides, and maybe you can introduce yourself further. Thanks.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Am I unmuted?
You are unmuted.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Val. Good morning, everyone. I'm really happy to be here, especially since it's May 1st. Thanks to Val and OHCOW for inviting me, although I do have to admit it's a It's a little early for me as I'm now living the lazy retired life on Vancouver Island. Congratulations, of course, to John on his anniversary and his incredible contributions. My talk today is about knowledge activism and its relevance or connection to the prevention of stress and mental health problems in the workplace. I imagine some or even most of you have heard this KA term before this webinar, given that the OFL, OHCOW, and several unions, including, of course, USW, have made some use of the concept in their training and communications. But just to be clear what we are talking about, let me begin by outlining how I define KA based on past research. Slide 2, please. Although my early research on mining in the 1980s identified some important differences in the way reps operated, it wasn't until I and colleagues did research in the auto sector in 2005 that we first coined the term knowledge activism. We defined worker OHS reps as those who strategically collect and employ information and knowledge to promote and achieve improvements in workplace health and safety, using both qualitative interview data and large sample survey data. A later study, which actually involved John, of multiple occupations done in 2012-2013, offered further evidence that relative to other types of representation, KA reps were much more effective at challenging management control and gaining substantial improvements in OHS conditions. Researchers in the UK, Australia, South Africa, and Europe have subsequently found evidence supporting KA as an effective form of OHS representation. Based on our research, we went on to identify several common or distinctive operational characteristics, as shown in slide 3. And I'll just briefly go over those. Reps tend to build knowledge and understanding, use them to strategically and tactically make hazard claims, and challenge management positions. They work within and outside the committee context. They recognize and understand the political demands of representation and understand the powers and incredibly important aspect of what they do. Educate and involve and organize workers as part of the way in which they mobilize power. They educate and persuade managers and supervisors in an ongoing way. They are assertive and persistent, involved in short and long-term strategies. They provide solutions rather than just complaining about issues. They recognize the value of inspections. That's in the next slide. The value of inspections, committee meetings, reports, and minutes, but they use them as tools to achieve change. They don't let them define their representative role in these terms. They recognize the limitations of current OHS law and rep work rights, but they learn how to use the law, rights, and regulations where they provide leverage. And they also often seek to get formal management and union support for more dedicated paid time for representation, as well as other rights or powers that can help them, and build and implement political strategies to achieve those gains. Okay, on slide 5. Now that we have some idea of what KA is and how KAs conduct themselves, what does knowledge activism, and I'll use the short term KA as I go through it, what does KA have to do with mental health? There are 2 main points I want to make today. The first revolves around the important role that knowledge activism can and I think does play in addressing and reducing workplace stress and mental health problems. My second point speaks to the stress and mental health challenges that KAs themselves are experiencing in their role as representatives, and the need for unions and other labor organizations to pay more attention to reducing activist stress and supporting their mental health. Before saying anything more, I want to first acknowledge that our original research did not focus specifically on worker rep stress and mental health. And indeed, most of our data was about the reps' efforts to prevent physical injuries and disease. This was largely a reflection of the time when the research was being done. When I first started to do research on representation in mining in the 1980s, right up to the rep research in the auto sector in the early 2000s, the labor movement recognition of stress and mental health issues was at its early stages. As such, very few reps at this juncture voiced any awareness of stress issues as something they saw themselves addressing in their committees or in their other activities. However, by the time we did the more major survey and interview study in 2012-14, violence and harassment were becoming more significant labor and public concerns, as Sophie's pointed out, which fueled increasing recognition that stress and mental health should be on the joint committee agenda. As well, since this later research included a range of white-collar and blue-collar occupations, there were definite occupational differences in the recognition of violence harassment occurring at that time. However, what was also evident, next slide, Pete, please. What was also evident in the 2012-14 research was that the KAs, to some extent across the occupational categories, were more likely to voice awareness of violence and harassment as OHS issues, and were actively trying to address the issues. A recognition of the broader scope of stress and mental health prevention beyond violence and harassment was still largely underdeveloped in most workplaces. But some KAs were distinctive in that they voiced a recognition of the need to expand their work and their committee's work in this area. These findings, the KAs were early adopters of violence, harassment, and stress issues, are consistent with our general data on KAs. That is, that knowledge activists are oriented towards research, education, and knowledge development. They're more likely to recognize new and emerging areas of concern, and accordingly are more likely to play an important role in shifting how occupational health is defined and perceived by employers, unions, the public, and the state. So although still at its early stages, it was the KA reps in 2012-13-14 who were reporting struggles with managers, government inspectors, and sometimes even their own union and fellow workers around getting them to pay more attention to stress and its impacts. I'm less certain whether the management's reluctance to acknowledge and address stress as a critical OHS issue is as much a problem today as it was then, given the lack of current research specifically asking this question. But I do know from recent study I did with Eric Tucker during COVID that many nursing and teacher reps were still struggling to get managers to pay serious attention to stress as a key consequence of COVID. This and my own personal experience as a rep in my university makes me think that we still have a long way to go in getting stress and mental health addressed. But the more significant point I'm trying to make here is that if stress prevention and treatment in the workplace is going to progress beyond the government and employer emphasis on violence and harassment, KAs are best placed to have a significant impact in making that happen. For the same reasons, they tend to be more effective in addressing conventional physical or chemical hazards. To confirm whether they are doing so and whether they are being successful certainly requires research dedicated to these questions, but I would suggest that KAs are likely to be critical leaders in this effort. Moreover, when unions and other labor organizations provide education and research support on stress definitions, measurement, and prevention, the kinds of activities that John's been engaged in for the last several years, it is likely the KA who will be most responsive, in as much they are generally more innovative and sensitive to new information and opportunities to expand their understanding. In as much as KAs take on an educational and persuasive approach to change, I would also argue that they can be a critical force for broader cultural and regulative change in the way workplace stress is defined, regulated, and addressed. They may well have already played a critical role in how things have changed thus far, but I acknowledge we need more research on this. I'm hoping that John's presentation today will speak at least in part to this. Of course, KAs can't achieve this goal of expanding the recognition and prevention of work stress by themselves as isolated representatives working in their respective workplaces. Organizational and network connections are crucial to any large-scale social change. But one of the major reasons organized labor may fall short of this goal is that the reps themselves are vulnerable to stress and burnout, a problem which labor organizations are best placed to address and need to address. Next slide, please. Now I have to again qualify my remarks. To my knowledge, there are no specific studies on the stress or mental health of OHS representatives. And as noted, this was not a focus of our original research. However, there is a substantial stress research literature on activists in other social justice areas, such as anti-racism, the environment, human rights, etc. And much of that literature suggests that significant stress and burnout go hand in hand with activism. Moreover, while we didn't design our research to look at rep stress, the worker representatives we interviewed often provided evidence consistent with the general literature on activism, in that many reps, including KAs, reported experiencing substantial stress, anxiety, frustration, and even depression as they carried out their activities. Some were worried whether they could continue for much longer without burning out, and although we've never tracked this specifically, there were indications that retention and turnover of worker representatives was a significant problem. For example, in one of our studies, when we tried to follow up with KA reps a year later, we discovered that several had either quit or had been effectively forced out of their jobs and had lost their employment. Many reps in all the studies told us that they had doubts about their ability to continue, or more explicitly, they didn't expect to continue much longer in their role because of the workload and stress. In terms of the sources of stress, workload was often a major problem. Next slide, please. In terms of sources of stress, workload was a major problem for KAs because they were trying to do their regular jobs as well as the committee research, education, political work, etc., that they thought was important, frequently without formal paid time allowances. And even when they were given a certain amount of time, the hours they put in far exceeded those required by law. This also often meant they were spending less time with their families, which became another source of conflict and strain for some. Although KAs tended to have more success than other reps, KAs, knowledge activists and other reps often talked about the frustration they experienced in trying to get management to make changes and complained about their limited power to make necessary improvements and the slow pace of change. Reps also complained to us about feeling threatened and harassed, either by individual managers and supervisors or as a part of a more concerted management campaign to get them to quit or back down. Inasmuch as KAs took on more significant OHS issues, it is less than surprising to find that KAs often experienced management pushback and reprisals. Conflicts with workers as well were often reported by reps as causing concern, and many cited the lack of support from their union and other representatives. Reps often talked about the ways in which managers and supervisors tried to undermine their efforts and their relationships with workers by trying to pin cutbacks, restrictions on overtime, wage restrictions, etc., on OHS changes that the reps had been addressing. In these contexts, of course, reps said they felt isolated and underappreciated. Next slide, please. While KAs were certainly among the reps who expressed concerns about workload and other stresses arising from their representation and activism, it is important to note that some KAs had been active for quite some time when we interviewed them, 5 or 10 years or even more, and they expressed a commitment to stay in their role for a longer term. It was evident then that they were much more comfortable and confident in their position than other KAs and reps. This recognizes that either the stress in some workplaces was less substantial, or some KA reps were better equipped or protected than others to deal with it, cope with the stress. I suggest that the differences in stress levels among KAs in particular reflect a bit of both. In some workplaces, it was clear that KAs, often the reps with less experience, were in a constant struggle with management, and as I said, sometimes with workers as well. While in others, reps reported a more collaborative or cooperative relationship, which also tended to translate in a pattern of more easily won successes. And with those successes, often a greater degree of respect and support from workers. Some researchers in the OHS area have rightly argued that the differences in conflict and outcomes reflects the fact that some firms are better managed than others with stronger built-in commitments to occupational health and safety. And there is certainly something to that. But I think it's also important to note that some of these less stressful relationships with managers and workers were at least partly a consequence of the work done by KAs over the preceding years to develop trust and legitimacy with management in the workplace. This was reflected in accounts of some veteran reps who talked about their efforts to build relationships and the improvements they'd seen in relations over time. Thus, it is important to recognize that the features that make knowledge activism more effective as a form of worker representation are also the same features that can help reps to manage or limit the stress associated with their activism. As any experienced KA knows, there are always going to be conflicts between labor and capital over OHS issues. But as we've argued elsewhere, knowledge activism offers reps a strategic and tactical framework which can yield positive worker gains while relying less on the confrontational politics that some reps employ. This in itself can help to reduce the stress, and to the extent that KAs also tend to be more effective or successful, success too is an important moderator of stress, in part because it reinforces their confidence, their relationships with workers, and their sense of meaning and accomplishment. But I emphasize again that the use of knowledge activist strategies does not mean that there are no conflicts and stress. Even for the most successful veteran KAs, their workplaces and labor processes and their relations were always subject to a variety of changes and pressures, which tended to introduce new OHS threats and or challenge the historical work the KAs had done to build relationships. And in that sense, all reps are subject to ongoing as well as new sources of stress, which they have to resolve or cope with. So while there are clearly differences between workplaces in the stress they present to reps, it does appear that some KAs are better positioned or able to manage or cope with stress better than other KAs and reps. To the extent that this translates into greater rep longevity and all the benefits that go with rep experience and knowledge, it is important for us to understand what makes some KAs more resilient and or protected from others. For example, in our data, it does appear that some KAs had somewhat different attitudes about their activities and how they judge their impact. That is, some recognize that change often takes time and patience, and as such, they experience less frustration and disappointment when their gains were gradual or initially limited. When asked what advice they would give reps just starting their position, Several reps pointed out that it was important for them not to get angry or frustrated, not only because expressing that anger often led to similar response from managers, but also because the reps recognized that it was not good for their own mental health to be angry all the time. As one put it, I think the main part is don't get too upset about things. Some may take a month or 3 months to get fixed but it usually comes around and is fixed in a reasonable amount of time. So get along with your boss, your foreman, whatever. Just play it cool. Don't get too upset because you know what? It doesn't help. So there are kinds of emotional labor that some reps employ for themselves and in their relationships, which help them to better manage the slow pace of change and also continue to keep their relations with management and workers on an even keel. Okay, slides. The next slide, please. However, the capacity of knowledge activists and other reps to cope with stress is not just on them. It's also a reflection of the social and other supports they have available to them. Lots of evidence in the general activist literature show that ability of reps to persist with their activism is strongly linked to the relationships they have with the organizations in which they are working. Some of these linkages are just basic emotional supports, providing channels for activists to express their concerns and get feedback and confirmation from others. But it's also about the range of resources that representatives gain through their organizational relationships. With respect to worker reps, labor unions, worker centers, and with respect to worker reps, labor unions, worker centers, and OHS centers are all relevant organizations here. For example, in our findings, KAs often talked about the crucial information and advice they had obtained from organizations like OHCOW. But even in this situation, sometimes it was the emotional support, just the connection with somebody who knew something else about health and safety, that was part of that exchange that seemed to make the difference in their confidence and self-respect. When Eric Tucker and I did our recent study on worker voice during COVID, reps differed in the extent to which they felt they were supported by their union. Those that felt supported expressed considerable satisfaction with the help and support they received, even when they were still not successful in getting management to listen to them. Not surprisingly, those who weren't well connected to their union or other organizations like OHCOW expressed more concerns that they felt stressed and uncertain about their situation and insecure about whether they were doing what was needed. Critically, they felt more isolated, and consequently, these were the reps that began to question their continued involvement. Of course, reps themselves must do some of the work needed to build and maintain those relationships. And as our evidence shows, this is a key feature of KAs. Most of them actively work to develop their relationships, networks, and connections within and outside their workplaces. However, we also have to ask, what can labor organizations do to ensure that reps are better connected and supported so they get both the emotional support they need and the other resources that give them the confidence and tools they need to succeed? Here are a few suggestions that I have to make. This is the final slide. Although I'm sure there are other ways that organizations can help. Open and maintain periodic and emergency two-way communications. This was something that we found in the COVID study quite a bit. Help reps to build and maintain rep networks within and between workplaces. So these are direct connections between reps in different workplaces and even within the same workplace. Expand and strengthen rep education programs which address rep stress and mental health. So not just educate reps about mental health issues, but also about the importance of taking care of themselves and about getting support, and so on. Make professional mental health counseling services available to reps, recognize and address their concerns and requests about workload, training, and education. There's lots of things, of course, that can be done through collective bargaining. These issues often fall by the wayside in collective bargaining, of course, as many people know, but they're important issues to address. Okay, I'll end it here. And as I said, I hope my comments lead into John's presentation to some extent. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Alan. Fascinating. Sorry, I'm of a blank screen on my, my computer, but hopefully you guys can all see something else. And much appreciated. I don't know if anybody has any questions right now for Alan, or should we move into John's presentation and then we can discuss the whole at the end of that. Thanks for posting some of the articles, John. That's helpful. And as I said earlier, we will post the slide decks. And I guess, Alan, I was going to ask you if we can post your paper as well that you used today, but on the website for the event. So
Yeah. Well, actually, perhaps I could do for you is put in a little more a reference list as well, so people can access that. I haven't
yeah,
done that yet, so the copy I sent you.
yeah, that would be great. Thanks very much. I'm sure everybody will appreciate it, and I'm sure everybody here attending an event like this is a form of knowledge activism, right? And it's also sharing. There is an emotional support to it and a validation, but I think everyone here, I think what you presented resonates, that in terms of workload, in terms of the challenges, and in terms of the coping with the slow pace of change, and seeing value in the relationships that you develop in the meantime. Sylvia, did you have something you want to comment on that?
No, I was just turning my camera on because it's going on and off, so I won't whether or not it still had good sound. I'm just going to keep it off.
Great, your sound sounded good. Okay,
Okay.
we'll switch now to John, and who probably doesn't need any introduction to the audience, but he is an occupational hygienist at the OHCOW Hamilton Clinic, and has been so for 35 years, as we were marking today. And he has been a pioneer in a number of areas, in the area of using survey tools to get collective information in order to support workplace decision making, and also a pioneer in the workplace mental health as a health and safety issue that needs to be included along with other physical and environmental hazards. And in fact, then the intersection of those two interests, of a tool and a survey, and workplace mental health, and the development and shepherding and support of Stress Assess and the COPSUC survey that is part of the mental injury toolkit. So John, over to you, and we're interested to hearing how research into practice and applying knowledge activism and into tool development and other aspects of your work to support workers and workplaces. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Val. It's a fancy title, but really what it is a history of what happened in the development of Stress Assess. And I want to start with Oudyk. Actually, they sponsored a research day back in 2008, and they got activists together, and OHCOW people and some academics, and we sat down and we asked some questions about what is research and how can we integrate research into our efforts to improve the workplace. And from this group, OHCOW started regular stakeholder meetings. And in 2009, Alec Farquhar sponsored or led such a meeting and established a group that was charged with supporting worker representatives and taking action on prevention and compensation. Now, a number of people on this committee, including myself, experienced some illnesses in early 2010, and so things were kind of delayed. But by the end of the year, a subcommittee had been put together, and this committee was looking at producing tools, and so they took an inventory of what tools were available. And what they found was there was one topic which was of high interest but had no tools, and that was the measurement of workplace stress. So this was the topic selected as most needing attention. And in the meantime, Nick DiCarlo invited me up to a workshop at Port Elgin for their health and safety reps. And we explored different ways of measuring stress, and we took about 6 or 7 different surveys and had these poor participants there, fill them all out. And we we tried different ones and got feedback on what they liked and didn't like about the different tools. The Mental Injury Tool Group was established at about that time, and here's a list of some of the people who were there at the beginning. More people came in later and other people left. There was a lot of change. But I really have to highlight the efforts that Terry Szymanski provided. Without her, she was really the engine for the whole mental injury tool group. She's the one that called the meetings and got people interested. Her excitement about the tool was also infectious and got lots of people to get involved. Now, in 2011, the Mental Injury Tool Group came together for a workshop, and what we did is we looked at all the different theories behind measuring stress and looked at the tools, and again, these people filled out different questionnaires. Then Andy King, who was also pivotal not only in LOARC, but in the Mental Injury Tool Group, connected us with Salvador Moncada from Spain, and he was part of an organization called ISTAS. It was a Spanish labor academic collaboration, very similar to LOARC in its style. And we talked to Salvador about how he used the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire as a tool for unions to use to measure stress in their workplaces. Now, this tool was originally created by Tage Christensen in Denmark, and so we contacted him, and he gave us permission to use it. It's widely used all over the world. And at the top right-hand corner, you'll see Salvador and Tage together, and below is Andy King, who made it. So based on that decision to use to try out the COPSUC questionnaire, we piloted at 3 union conferences over 2011, and among union members of 21 social service agencies, which ended up almost 2,200 surveys received from those groups. And we had lots of suggestions of things that were missed, and so we added them, and we tried wherever possible to use established questions rather than make our own up. And this was the results of the 3 conferences. We had almost 500 responses, and it was presented at a LOARC teach-in in Ottawa, held in 2011. And from that, we concluded that, yes, we liked the COPSUC tool, and we developed a guidebook and also a toolbox that was launched in October of 2012. And this is what the 90-page guidebook covered. It had 6 parts. Why should we care? Stress, some of the assumptions, the terminology and approaches, which is some of the theory behind it, what other jurisdictions are doing, what my legal rights and protections are, and what does a workplace action plan look like, and some resources. Especially part 5 and 6 was put together by Terry, and they were really good practical checklists on how to do a survey in your workplace, and then how to get a response from the results of those surveys. We also had a number of abstracts and posters that were accepted at different conferences. I want to highlight the one, the 3rd one here by Nancy Johnson and Erna Bushna and myself. In 2012, OHCOW did a survey of all their health and safety reps. Alan was just talking about how there isn't much research on health and safety reps, but we did the COPSUC survey with them, and we extracted the information about the offensive behaviors, both the experience and the type of symptoms that were associated with those who experienced those amongst the health and safety reps in OHCOW. Then we met with the Ministry of Labor in 2013. We explained to them what we were doing, and we also came with an ask. We asked that they recognize psychosocial hazards and that they should be covered by the General Duty Clause and other clauses within the Act, and that therefore orders could be issued for specific violations. We also asked that they publish a guide for workplaces. At that time, they had put out the MSD guide for musculoskeletal diseases, and we thought that something like that on stress. Well, almost a decade later, we finally put one out without the assistance of the Ministry of Labor, but it eventually got out. And we asked that they do a blitz of office environments, healthcare, and retail for psychosocial hazards. This had been done in Europe, in Denmark, and in the Netherlands, and there was a blitz throughout the EU in 2012 evaluating psychosocial hazards. And labor inspectors would go into workplaces with checklists to evaluate the psychosocial conditions. Also at this time, the CCOHS was helping us out, and they sponsored a webinar, and this was many years ago, about a decade ago, and over 1,000 people signed up for it, which was a first for them. And we talked about it to their audience. They also helped us develop our first app, Measure Workplace Stress, and I think it is still available online. It compares an individual's results. They answer the questions and then grade the score according to the Danish comparison population. We didn't have Canadian data at that time. And then it gave ideas on how to address certain issues. If you're concerned about recognition and appreciation, there are some ideas here. We also got involved with the international network for COPSUC users, and they had a number of workshops and international workshops every 2 years, and we attended the fifth one that was in Paris in 2015, and there we presented a paper on different ways of reporting back the results of the COPSUC survey, and we included the mental injuries tool groups, Ted Haynes, who was a big help at the beginning, and of course Terry Semensky, who was the engine driving this. In 2016, with the help of Peter Smith from the Institute of Work and Health, we connected with an organization, a polling organization called ECOS. And using them, we conducted a cross-Canada survey of workers who were employed in workplaces with at least 5 workers during February and March of 2016, and was available in English and French, and we had over 4,000 respondents, and ECOS provided weighting factors to adjust them to the labor force surveys. Peter Smith also took that information and helped us with test, retest, reliability, internal consistency, and confirmatory factor analysis and others, and these were to establish the validity and reliability. The face validity and content validity was something that the MIT group and the people who created the survey had already done. And here is the article that was published in 2019 that established the validity and reliability of the survey. We also worked with system partners, the Ministry of Labor, WSIB, and the other HSAs. Mental Health Working Group, which put on a number of webinars to raise awareness about mental health and also to talk about mental harm prevention. During one of these, the Ministry of Labor also presented this. And just as we had asked the Ministry of Labor to recognize that mental disorders were equivalent to physical disorders, and as Sylvia was saying earlier, still calling for that. But at that time, the ministry basically said that for the purposes of the Act, mental stress, chronic and traumatic, are not occupational illnesses and do not trigger notification requirements. And they also don't meet the critical injury definition. So they were insistent that the Act only applies to physical hazards, not mental hazards. The CCUHS also helped us to develop our Stress Assess tool, which is an online tool which allows workplaces to create their own survey and distributes them and then have an analysis and a report generated. And Sue Freeman and Alan Powell and a number of other people at the CCUHS helped us build this, and it was launched in January of 2018. And it's still available and still being used regularly. 2019, we did another eco survey, and again, we had the same similar number of respondents, but we had over 600 people who we could connect with the previous survey, so we could look at how things had changed. And again, we went to the next workshop, which was in Santiago, Chile, and there, this meeting was specifically focused on some changes that were made to the COPSUC survey. We originally started with COPSUC 2, and now we're using COPSUC 3, and we were trying to establish the properties, the validity and reliability of the Canadian English and French surveys. This information that we shared at that meeting was eventually written up into an article and published, and is available free online. And then the next workshop was supposed to be a more practical application of the survey, and it was held in Istanbul in 2019. And there we reported on a collaboration, again, that Terry was key in spearheading with members of OHCOW in the corrections, provincial corrections ministry. And there we had also people from management from the ministry, and also people from Queen's University who helped us with qualitative analysis of the comments at the end of the survey. And at that time, we also looked at the changes from 2016 to 2019 in the cross-Canada surveys. And what we found was that job security scores had improved, but there was less full-time work. And we were kind of curious at whether this was by preference. There were slightly better scores overall across the board, except for sexual harassment, threats of violence, and physical violence, which had slightly increased. There were decreases in bullying, discrimination, and vicarious offensive behaviors. And a matched analysis of people who filled both surveys out reflected similar results as when you just looked at the overall averages. But the question that arose was, is just the new normal? Does the baseline of what people consider a stressful workplace keep changing over time? And if things get worse, but people expect it to get worse, we're wondering if that changes. Then the pandemic hit, and we were watching reports coming out of China and supporting a number of union health and safety staff, especially in the healthcare field, answering questions and providing information. And we formed an ad hoc group of union health and safety reps, activists, and interested academics, and started to make a survey for healthcare workers during the pandemic. We launched it in April 6th, and then soon after that, Dorothy Wigmore, Alec Farquhar, and Laura Lazansky took the healthcare one and made it more generic so that all workers could use it. And that was launched at the end of April. That was during the first wave. We relaunched the surveys in the second wave in November of the same year. We had almost 6,000 completed responses for the healthcare survey, and getting close to 4,000 for the non-healthcare workers. And the second wave, you could see the survey fatigue hitting in. Not even 1,000 healthcare workers and almost 2,000 non-healthcare workers in the second survey. And with Peter Smith, we and the ad hoc committee, we presented the reports, and it was quite interesting. These are the scores of anxiety symptoms broken down by whether people are working at home or are working at work and feel that all of their personal protective equipment needs were met, 50 to 99%, or less than 50%, or none of their needs were met. And you can see how their anxiety scores increase the less PPE they have. And it's even worse working with not enough PPE than not working at all, which was quite interesting. And also, being at work and having all your needs met was better than working remotely. And when we looked at the infection control procedures, it was even more bigger difference between working remotely and working at work with all your needs met. So yeah, what we found was that there was a significant amount of fear, anxiety, stress, and depression amongst workers who were not working in healthcare, but working outside. It was also in healthcare. And that their mental health experiences were related to how well they were protected by infection control procedures and personal protective equipment. And the lowest level of anxiety was amongst people who had their infection control practices effectively addressed, and that was even lower than those working at home. And the highest levels were those who did not have those protections in place. These were written up into 2 articles, one for healthcare and one for non-healthcare. We also worked with education workers in the second wave and created a survey for them, and again, over 4,000 respondents. And we compared the education workers who were in person compared to online, and online teachers and education support workers were doing a lot worse doing online than in person. These results were also published in 2 papers. And finally, about a year ago, we did another ECOS survey, the 3rd survey, and we presented that at May Day last year. And the takeaway points from that one was that flexibility with respect to working from home seems to work the best. Don't work too many hours. That's a no-brainer. Take your breaks. It was amazing the amount of difference between people who took their breaks and those who didn't. It was quite a contrast. Keep the amount of paperwork under control. Things get worse if you have to put in extra unpaid hours to get your work done. And there are some advantages to non-full-time work, but there are also some sacrifices. Good social capital, which is trust, justice, and respect in the workplace, is associated with very positive outcomes. And we desperately need to support those for whose work involves emotional demands. Now we have, we also had hosted the 9th International COPSEC workshop in Canada last year. It was very small because of the COVID restrictions and things like that. We had some online people as well. We've put together a number of workplace tools that are available online. We took the 90-page guidebook and made it into a very nice, shorter and more colorful booklet that has the 5-step approach and some two case studies that work through the 5 steps. And we have a number of videos of workplaces that have used the survey, some a number of times, and you can, some of it was good experience, some of it was not so good. It's a mixed reaction. So what's next? Well, the MIT group, the way it was established originally, has basically evaporated or retired. So maybe we need to reconstitute the MIT group as a kind of a community practice. The partnership with the CCUHS has weakened. The people that we worked with have mostly left the organization. So, but the product is still seeing regular use. Our partnership with the IWH continues. We're actually working on a paper currently with members there on wage theft, people working extra hours and not getting paid. There are other provinces that are interested in doing the stress assess. There seems to be a lot of interest in BC and also from Quebec, and we're wondering if we can find partners there who can take that up. We need to update stress assess, incorporate the 2023 reference data. And personally, I'm looking at retiring sometime and passing on the baton, and we're working with people internally in OHCOW who are interested in carrying on this type of work. And the 10th International COPSEC workshop will be held in Malmo, Sweden next year, and that will be. But our goal with all of this work was try to build a bridge between research and practice, and we hope that the tools that we have produced have made some improvement. Furthermore, to follow up on some of Alan's comments, the law always seems to lag, not to mention enforcement, especially with psychosocial hazards, with the ministry not willing to accept it on par with physical hazards. Stress assess is a tool, not a solution, to collect and systematically present workers' experiences. The key is not necessarily to do the survey, but to have a strategy to convince the workplace to address the concerns that might be validated by the survey if you use it. But without a determination to do something with the results, even a tool that has the best evidence possible will fail. It's not necessarily the quality of the tool, although a better tool may make things easier, but it's the determination and commitment to improve that will make the difference. And that's where knowledge activists come in. Okay, thank you. And I'll stop there.
Thanks a lot, John. Thanks for the presentation, but of course, bigger thanks for the stewardship of the issue for all the years that you've described, and yeah, it continues to have an impact. I think it's the I think of the term servant leader because I think that those of us engaged in this work, I guess, that we're always trying to make things better. But in workplaces across the province, the country, and any small shop that calls us, right? But that in developing the tools and recognizing the knowledge activism features, I think, and being able to equip people to further their knowledge and apply it in the workplace, I think is actually critical. So I thank actually all the speakers for their efforts from different aspects of that. So we can open it up now to questions and answers. We have a few minutes, and our speakers may be able to stay longer if need be. There was a question I missed, I think, in the switch from Al, and you answered it. So I don't know if you wanted to elaborate further on the question about government support, particularly at the provincial level, in fostering knowledge activism. Alan?
No, that's fine. But I mean, if John has any insights to add, I think he mentioned the role of the ministry in Ontario implementing it into their legislation, but I'm not sure. Maybe the role of implementing stress assess, governments implementing stress assess or helping employers.
Yes, that's something that we asked them to do back in 2014 or 13. I can't remember exactly. But they said basically that was the job of the health and safety associations, and so that's when the group, the mental health and group. Workplace mental health group was established, and Val was actually a big part of that for longer than I was. And we did try to raise awareness and make sure that all the organizations that had tools had staff that were able to support those tools. But I don't think it went too much farther than that. With the compensation board, at first they would not compensate chronic stress, and that was challenged, and it was found to be unconstitutional for them to discriminate between mental and physical disability, and so chronic stress was accepted. However, chronic stress was accepted at a higher standard than other occupational diseases. Instead of just having a contributing, or making a material contribution to the disease, it had to be the predominant disease when it came to mental health. So we asked, well, I asked at the meetings with the ministry and the other partners if the ministry could recognize the equivalence of physical and mental health. And the answer I was told, although I don't think it was official at the time, was basically if employers are clamoring for it, they'll probably get it. And so far they haven't. And so I think that's where it sits right now, is that unless there is pressure or a legal proceeding that challenges this distinction between physical and mental injuries in the Act, it will remain.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, there is a system committee, an Ontario Prevention System Committee now that's it's a combination of violence and harassment prevention and workplace mental health. And we'll see later in the month a number of members of that committee. So particularly WSPS and PSHSA, who are two of the four health and safety associations, have developed some tools, and they are more collaborative and than they were, but they're not. I think everyone comes at things from their own perspective and feels that perspective is unique. So they're developing tools that fit with the perspective and with the presumably with the sort of I wouldn't say demands, but or needs of their clients, or what of how to serve their clients, or the feedback, I guess we would say. So, but they are more collaborative, and it'll be interesting to hear them present. So some of that is on violence risk assessment and its evolution into a new tool, and also PSHSA has developed a new workplace mental health tool that involves forming committees and working through things, but they're not specifically using stress assess. It has been shared and by the health and safety associations in some circumstances, but they don't rely on it heavily as a system tool, unfortunately. I have one little. I was going to say, in terms of provinces, the right to participate, I think, is partly knowledge activism, but how it's actually executed in workplaces and in detail. And so the joint health and safety committees and health and safety reps, and then sort of mandatory training for them, and even the including consideration of hazards and their prevention. All of that is a start, I think, on paper of some of this. It's trying to foster knowledge as well as then knowledge activism representation, but I'm not sure it's fully evolved, I guess, and so that's something else to think about. Other areas to influence, even potentially, in terms of certification training or other efforts we could bring to bear. But our role, we're not a training organization, so our role is to learn science, and then to translate that into information and or tools that can be of value to workers in workplaces, and then to support their implementation. Great. And I see Ken had a question about a previous talk from last year, so I'm going to follow up on that.
But can I just, before you go move on?
Yeah.
Val, I just wanted to address something that Logan's question about what can governments do. I think something that I think needs to be added there is the importance of enforcement and the extent to which reps need to have the protection that Ministry of Labor inspectors are supposed to offer them, especially when they're in situations when they're being harassed, threatened, but also just generally when then employers refuse to follow the regulations that exist. Now, improved regulations, of course, are always on the table as important benefits, but just enforcing the ones that exist would make a big difference. And for non-unionized workers, a lot of the things that are said today about the mental health strains on reps are even worse for them, substantially worse, I would suggest. And anything that helps to support them, including Ministry of Labor inspections and willingness to act against employers, but also I would suggest support for worker centers would be an important step that governments can take to begin to address the deficits that non-union workers are facing. Because many of them, they just don't have anyone to talk about organizational support. They have virtually nothing.
Yes, it's true. We've discovered that in our work with migrant farm workers and temporary foreign workers and newcomers, that even the anti-reprisal protections are not really protective. And so we are very cautious, even, and like we share that information as we ought to, because it's, it's part of the structure of the system, but we do it in a guarded way, because there's still a long way to go to realize the full level of protection, I think, and worker engagement that's in the model of the legislation in Ontario, at least. But Sylvia, did you have something you wanted to add? And then there's a question here about applying.
I was just going to say that, you know, like there's the things, obviously enforcement's a huge issue, which we all can agree on. But I do think that, you know, like from a legislative standpoint, when you look at Quebec, and I mentioned earlier that, you know, they do have mental health included in their right to refuse legislation. So there's no reason Ontario and every other jurisdiction should have less protection for workers. So, you know, we from Labor need to work with the federations of labor and others to push to have it included. And you know, for workplaces that do have unions, whether they have a joint health and safety committee or a rep, they have to really be involved in assessing all the risks, and they want to be at that table helping to develop programs. And, you know, I would recommend them using OHCOW's resources, the stress assess, the mental injury toolkit, and those resources, and take those initiatives and implement them in their workplace. And when we look at just workplace inspections, for example, our workplaces have to add categories on there to include psychosocial hazards. And when they are, you know, identified, then they have to do everything to address them. And I do think because mental health is clearly the #1 global issue affecting the Canadian economy when it comes to, you know, the amount of lost productivity in the workplace. It's a financial incentive for employers to try and do what they can to promote the mental health and include that in their overall health and safety programs. Because when we look at how many workers are absent in any given day in Canada as a result of mental health issues, or are off on long-term or short-term leave, it's a reason to care. And I mean, others have mentioned, John did, and others, the pandemic and the effects of that. We're still reeling in and continuing to feel that additional pressure from that alone. So, I mean, something has to happen to change the way the culture is, and that society acknowledges the importance of good mental health. So those are just some thoughts that I wanted to share.
Thanks. I see. Oh, do you have something to add, John? You're muted. You're muted. John, you're muted.
Yeah, I was looking at the question in the chat about small workplaces.
Yes.
We actually find that stress assess works better in small workplaces than large workplaces. And the reason is first of all, we get a better response rate in a smaller workplace. And if a small workplace approaches us with a desire to improve the psychosocial conditions in the workplace, that really helps, you know, once you get the results and brainstorm some ideas on how to move forward. The ability of a smaller organization to respond is much better. And since our services are free, you know, there's no financial barrier to them engaging with us on this. Whereas with a large workplace, you're often faced with low response rates, often below 30%. Plus, once you get the results and break them down by department, if there isn't someone in each department who is willing to take the results and work with them to apply them to their situation, then nothing will happen. And if you do a survey and nothing happens, it's worse than doing no survey at all. If you raise people's expectations for change and then you know, disappoint them, things will actually be more negative than they were if you hadn't done it.
That makes sense. Okay. Well, it's just after 12, and I don't see any other questions in the chat nor any hands up. So I'm wondering if each speaker has some last few words. I did put the link for the Mayday page on our website, which then links to the registration for the other 2 right now, and by the end of today, we'll have the events posted for the 22nd and the 29th. Next week's focus is actually even hosted and includes COPSOC network people from around the world, which is really enriches the discussion, I think, to see the parallels and the unique challenges and solutions that they've come up with, which is really interesting. And then on the 15th, we're going to hear about some research projects in Ontario around PTSD, around suicide prevention, and around unique factors affecting northern workplaces. And then on the 22nd, we're going to hear about efforts in the system with respect to pain management and opioid harm reduction, and also workplace violence risk assessment. And John's going to come back and talk about the importance of survey validation, but also the other sort of more qualitative aspects of supporting surveys so they can be effective in the workplaces. And the last week is a number of tools, 2 shared by PSHSA, one their version of a stress. It's not entirely a survey. It includes a survey, but it's the system collaborative system of engaging to jointly problem solve workplace mental health. Also, their work on workplace violence and education, and then a new tool by OHCOW called Job Assess, which includes cognitive and psychosocial hazards. So that's the month. But in the meantime, let's hear from our speakers anything to add further about knowledge activism in general and its role in workplace mental health and injury prevention. I'll go to Sylvia first.
No, I just wanted to say I thank you for inviting me today, and I think these sessions that OHCOW is putting on is very helpful, and being able to share that information on the websites later for others who aren't able to participate today is really beneficial. So thank you for that, and I just want to congratulate John once again and thank him for everything that he has done all these years in health and safety. He's very respected and appreciated, and I am really feel fortunate that I've been able to work with John, and USW has over the years. And thank you, Val and OHCOW, for the invitation today. And I thought Alan's presentation was excellent, as was John's.
Great, thanks, Sylvia, and thank you for all of USW's efforts to get us here in so many different ways, and for taking the time to share that with us today, and for your ongoing support of OHCOW. I'm just going to paste in our YouTube channel. You reminded me that the video, because we've also live streamed on YouTube, it will render as a video right away if you want to share with anybody in the short term, and then we will post each talk in a playlist in the next few days. Thanks. Okay, Alan, any
I guess the only final thing I would say, or just emphasis that I would place on the point that ultimately the reps are pretty critical to whether or not change actually happens in a workplace on the issue of mental health specifically. I think they are pretty critical. And in that respect, it's really important, I think, for all organizations involved in labor to pay attention to their stress and mental health and do what they can to address it. Because I might be wrong, maybe there are a lot of things going on around supporting the mental health of activists, but my guess would be that there isn't, and they're often left to their own devices. And as I said, knowledge activists many of them are quite resilient and quite strong, and some of the key characteristics of knowledge activism is protective in many ways in and of itself. But nevertheless, organizations need to step up, recognize the problem and the issue, and provide as much support as they can.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that really resonated.
And thank you again to everybody for.
Thank you, Alan. And I think that right, that we need to pay attention. I was just wondering, John, I know you've run the survey at conferences many times. And sorry, I don't know if we have a mic open, not getting a lot of feedback. But anyways, John, did you run it several times? Did you ever notice a higher level of stress, or converse, that here's people working collectively against a common cause? There might be even, benefit to that.
Well, as I mentioned with ONA, we did the survey when we first put it together in 2012, and they surveyed over 200 of their health and safety reps at that time. And then we redid the survey last year with their health and safety reps and got over 400 responses. And it was quite a dramatic difference. Things were a lot worse for health and safety reps now than they were a decade ago. Yeah, that really underlines the concerns that Alan was mentioning.
Yep.
But finally, I just want to say that, OHCOW, we've created tools. We've tried to help workplaces do something. But as Alan says, and as Sylvia knows with her people, unless you have somebody in the workplace, a knowledge activist who is a bulldog who will grab an issue and won't let go despite all the resistance they get from management, from fellow workers, even from the ministry sometimes. Without people like that, our work is wasted. So I really want to thank the activists in the workplaces who take these issues on and keep at it. And any way we can support them, let us know. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. That is, yes. Should applaud them, and what we can do to serve and support them, right? And so we're always interested in hearing back from people on that too. Okay, I think we'll close right now. And as I said, we'll be posting the videos on our YouTube channel, and the slide decks will be on the Mayday page. And we do welcome people coming to the next 4 sessions, because we are going to spend the month talking about this from different angles. So appreciate everyone attending, especially the speakers. And Tony, thanks for your technical support. And now we'll turn it off. Say goodbye. Have a good day, and happy May Day again. Thanks for joining us. Bye.